Hey everybody, and welcome back to BK's Bullets. Today we're going to be talking about Neil Gaiman's Eternals. Hey everybody, and welcome back to BK's Bullets. As always, I'm your host, Brent, and today we're going to be talking about Neil Gaiman's Eternals. Now, I have done an overview for this on the channel, so go check that out if you haven't seen it. That's where you can see a whole lot of art and just me trying to remember what the hell happened in this book. Well, now I've reread it. This is 7 issues long. This came out in the 2000s. I remember picking up the single issues when I was in college. So this was printed. This is the second printing from 2020. Oh gosh, it doesn't even say. Thanks for nothing. So I remember picking this up in college. There you go. So probably 2007-ish, 2005, something like that. So this is the second thing Neil Gaiman did coming out of his, I guess, like Miracle Man rights issues with Marvel. Marvel owned, now they own the rights to Miracle Man. So they struck some deal with Neil Gaiman where I think they would cut him in on a piece of the pie, something like that, for him to write some Marvel comics. So he did Eternals, and before then he did this other book over here, I'm reaching for it, 1602. Now we will talk about this another day, because now that I've talked about it for 2 videos now, I'm definitely interested in rereading it and, giving it another go. I've read this once or twice, I didn't think that much of it, and after reading Eternals again, I can understand why. So I think this is my 3rd time reading this book. I remember reading it as it came out, as I was picking up the single issues, month to month. And I remember it, like, rereading it all together, I think, some point later on once those were done. I've reread it all here in this collection, and I'm still not convinced why this, is lauded or anything like that. I think it's mainly because of the name. So let's talk about Neil Gaiman, right? Who is Neil Gaiman, Brent? Why do I keep hearing this guy's name? Well, Neil Gaiman is kind of a gothy writer who came out and he burst onto the scene in the late 1980s, early 1990s with Sandman from Vertigo, DC Comics. I don't think it originally was a Vertigo title until a little bit later on in its run, but that is what he is instrumentally known for, the creation of the character of Dream, of the interpretation of Death as the young goth girl who you may have seen, and it's currently adapted as an audio book on Audible. And then I think it's also coming as a Netflix series next year. They just announced a whole bunch of the cast. And so out of the Sandman universe, you have characters like Lucifer and that comic book series by Mike Carey, which turned into the Fox show, which is now on Netflix, even though I think that's very loosely based on the comic book. Although it is, I think, under the DC Vertigo banner in terms of like producing credits and stuff like that. So Neil Gaiman did that, and then he went and started writing novels. He wrote American Gods, which is a show on Starz. I have not seen any of that on there. There's also a sequel to that called Anansi Boys. He wrote some other books you may have heard of called Stardust, which is a movie, which I think is a very fun movie after all. And then most recently, the thing that I think I've seen all together was Angels and Omens, something like that. Not Angels and Demons, that's the Dan Brown book. Devils and Omens, something like that. Omens, search for Omens on Amazon Prime and you'll find it. But that was based on a book as well, and that was a miniseries on Amazon Prime with David Tennant and Michael, not Shannon. Oh gosh, the guy from the sex TV show. He didn't play Kinsey, Masters of Sex, that guy. And he was also in Twilight, he's now in Prodigal Son. I can't remember. His name starts with an S. I can't remember it. Michael Sheen? Is that it? Michael Sheen? I think that may be it. It's also, that guy actor was also in Frost and Nixon movie from way back. And if you're only into comic book movies, you may not be familiar with some of these films, but I like a whole bunch of films. I like a whole bunch of movies and TV shows and comic books. So that's kind of where Neil Gaiman got his start. So because of Sandman, because of this legendarium around him that he was such this great writer, Marvel just had to get him over and had to have him write some stuff for them, thinking that these may be the new Marvel classics from Neil Gaiman, the way that they could have a Sandman. Well, it didn't really turn out that way, so, and I guess in the way of, him focusing on Jack Kirby characters, which the Eternals are, Marvel in the same way wanted something from Neil Gaiman that they could say, this stands on its own, this is our Neil Gaiman creation, even though he never really gave them that, because he didn't create anything new for Marvel, he just kind of retreaded the old stuff. I mean, 1602 was 1960s Marvel in the 17th century, in 1602, exploring England and North America and the whole settlement, Jamestown, all that sort of stuff. It's a very beautiful book, very dense. This Eternals is not as dense. It's also beautiful, in my opinion, if you like John Romita Jr. artwork. Now, like I said in the overview, probably, this is John Romita Jr. at his best. He's not inked by Klaus Janson, and even though Klaus Janson is a great inker, when him and John Romita meet, I think it just gets a little dark, a little muddy, and a little sloppy. Although that could be Jrjr, maybe his pencils aren't up to snuff anymore, who knows. But on Eternals, your inker here is Danny Mickey and Tom Palmer, with assists by Tim Townsend, Jesse Delperdang, and some Klaus Janson. But since Klaus Janson isn't all over it like he is, I think, on like World War Hulk and some of his more recent Spider-Man stuff, you get the nice crisp lines that you expect from classic John Romita Jr. I mean, Danny Mickey and Scott Hanna, who did him on Amazing Spider-Man with JMS, those guys are, I think, the premier Jrjr inkers if you had something like a premier Jrjr inker, right? But there's just a cleanness and crispness to every line on these pages, and everything seems intentional and stylistic as opposed to quick, fast, and easy, which I think is where kind of Klaus Janson kind of runs over Jrjr's artwork with the quick and fast and loose. So I think this is a standout piece from John Romita Jr., even though, like, storytelling wise, it's not as strong as some of his other works. No fault for John Romita Jr., I think it's more about Neil Gaiman. So Neil Gaiman is this heady writer, right? Like Sandman is all about concepts and ideas. And now I want to say here, I have not read all of Sandman. I've read the first 5 volumes, maybe 6. And by the time I got to that 4th, 5th, and 6th one, it was a slog to read for me. Very slow, very kind of meandering all over the place. Didn't seem like there was a driving plot to the series instead of a bunch of little vignettes that were collected stories. Now that's fine, but I think my expectations going in were for this big epic, the way that Preacher is, or Why the Last Man, or these other Vertigo series. Hellblazer is like not really one long epic, but it does have continuing threads. Like he ages from beginning to end in that Vertigo series. So I think I was expecting a little bit more of an epic as opposed to smaller vignettes. Now, maybe towards the end it gets way better, who knows? But to my knowledge, reading the probably almost half of Sandman that I did, watching the Omens show on Amazon Prime. Sorry, I can't remember that name of that show properly, but it seems to me, and even that series was fun, well acted, but it wasn't heavy on action. And the same can be said for Eternals and 1602, is that it's not heavy on action. So there's 2 action scenes in these 7 issues, and I think for a superhero comic, that is a little weird. Now, is it really a superhero comic? I mean, what are the Eternals, Brent? Well, we've talked about this in a little bit in the overview, but the Eternals were created by Jack Kirby when he came back to Marvel. So let's talk about another prolific creator, right? Let's talk about Jack Kirby. So Jack Kirby created all these Marvel characters. They're on my shirt. I mean, nearly all of them are Jack Kirby creations or co-creations, whatever you want to call them. And he worked for Marvel for a long time in the 60s and the 70s. Then he got fed up with Marvel and with Stan Lee, and then he said, screw this, I'm going over to DC. So he went over to DC, and DC said, hey, welcome Jack Kirby, you can do whatever you want. And he said, great. And he pumped out 4 titles for them. And The Fourth World, Jimmy Olsen, Superman's Best Friend, The Tomorrow People, and there was a fourth one that I can't remember. But anyway, all these titles kind of interlinked, and they created what is called basically Jack Kirby's Fourth World. And that's where you get characters like Darkseid, Desaad, Orion, Light Ray, High Father, a Mother Box. All that stuff was created in the 70s by Jack Kirby. Now that stuff has been kind of, pulled into the mainline DC universe into the 80s and 90s, and now it's part of it was always here as part of the DC universe, when it really wasn't. It's all Jack Kirby. So after that, he left DC at the end of that, I don't know, a 19-issue run or something. Or no, this was 19 issues originally. And he came back to Marvel. And he did things like Black Panther. He did 12 issues there. He did a Captain America run. But he also did the Eternals. So the Eternals is another set of gods in the other universe of prolific comic book universes. But they have a different thing. They're not really they're still the two warring factions thing. In DC, you have the new gods of New Genesis, and then you have the gods of Apocalypse, which is really like Darkseid and Desaad, and maybe the female Furies and all stuff. I mean, they're all kind of interrelated and all that, and certainly there's more new gods on New Genesis that look humanoid or whatever, and have cool looking costumes, whereas a lot of the Darkseid stuff is maybe there's a couple characters and a lot of parademons and a lot of slaves that are building all those fire pits and stuff like that, right? So this is kind of the similar idea. It's 100 Eternals. So these are the beings that we're talking about here. They're called Eternals. And then you have the Deviants, and they actually manage to multiply where there's hundreds of thousands of them. And somehow there's hundreds of thousands of these monster-looking aliens. Not aliens, so to speak. They're evolved early humanoids that look like monsters. And maybe it's unknown to the world populace. This is what they look like. They all look different. So every deviant looks wildly different than each other. So you could draw any type of monster and call them a deviant in the Marvel universe. But there's only 100 Eternals. So what is an Eternal, Brent? We're beating around the bush here. You're 12 minutes in. Hurry up. So these Celestials, these are the big beings back here. Now, if you're only familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you might know the Celestial as the head of the Celestial in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie called Nowhere, Knowhere, which was the spaceport they were in for a majority of the first movie. That was the head of a Celestial. You also saw them in the flashbacks, I think in Guardians 2, maybe. They were certainly in one of those flashbacks. When they were dimension hopping and things like that. You definitely saw them when they when they were talking about the origin of the purple power stone that they were after. And these are these super tall beings with no eyes, no facial features, just lines and designs and stuff on their heads. It kind of looks like a really wacky psychedelic helmet. That is a Celestial. And these are super tall, huge, godlike beings that came down to Earth I think it said 1 million years ago. So after the extinction of the dinosaurs, and we're still kind of in the prehistoric age, and they took the Homo sapiens, I guess, and they altered them into two different phases. One was the Deviant class, and they made a whole bunch of them, and the other one was the Eternal class. So the Eternals, they gave different powers, and they gave them their their long life. The other thing about the Eternals is they have a purpose. They're meant to protect, preserve, and repair the Earth, and they're part of something called the Machine, and they rebuild themselves. They regenerate. They are reborn, so they can die. Although when they do die, they come back like that in their base in Antarctica, which is explored a little bit here, even though most of the plot has to do with them not really remembering who they are. But that is basically it. They're eternal gods who've been around forever, way before human civilization actually developed, is when the Eternals were, and given this great technology and stuff by the Celestials, and they've been battling the Deviants ever since, and also trying to protect and repair the Earth. So they're a little bit, involved to explain who these guys are. How they're going to do this in a Marvel movie that's supposed to come out here at the end of 2021, I have no idea. because that's a mouthful to try and understand. But they all have supernatural powers. They're all a little bit different. They all look different, these Eternals. They all have different personalities. But remember, there's only 100 of them. And of that 100, we're introduced to like 6 or 7 here in this book. We have Ikaris, Thena, Mokari, Jrjr, and Sprite, who's the... what's the name of the big bad guy? The Ajax is here. And their Highfather equivalent, I can't remember his name, Jrjr. So you might be thinking, Brent, these names sound like names of other gods in other pantheons. Well, you'd be right, because Jack Kirby's whole idea was these guys have been around for so long and have been involved in helping human civilization develop that their names became the inspirations for other gods. So Jrjr, their Highfather guy, sounds like Zeus from the Greek pantheon. You have Thena, sounds like Athena, the Greek goddess of war and wisdom, right? Sprite is a little kid, kind of like Loki is at some point. Maybe that was a little bit later. Circe is, the witch in the Wonder Woman lore. She's also a villain in the other comic book universe, but she's more well known as the woman who turns men into pigs from the Odyssey in that epic tale. You have Mokari, which they in this book they say he's like the inspiration for Osiris or Thoth in the Egyptian pantheon. You have Ajax, who might be Ajax from the Trojan War, a legendary warrior. You have Jrjr, which sounds like Druid, and he's got a very not really an Irish look. It's strange. He actually is more like Russian in this interpretation. And you also have Ikaris, or as I have always read him, Ikaris, because he spelled it with Ikaris, which is, Ikaris. If you don't remember the tale of Daedalus and Ikaris, this is the guy who flew too close to the sun on wings made of wax. The wings melted, he died. Sad story. But Ikaris flies and has like glowy eyes and stuff, and has super strength. So he's kind of maybe like a Superman analog for the Marvel comics. So that's kind of what the whole big idea concept of the Eternals is. So what is this book? Well, this book takes all that and kind of boils it down, and it's just trying to give you a little bit of that to get you interested maybe in the Eternals. It's not throwing it all at you hard and fast the way I did in this video, and you're going, whoa, Brent, that's too much of an explanation. We're like 15 minutes in here, bro. Get to the story already. But this book doesn't have all that. It's all in the background. It drip feeds you that slowly. And I think that's a strength of the book. If you're not familiar with the Eternals, you can pick this book up for sure and understand the concept of them, who they are, what they're here for, how they got there, how long they've been alive, and the inspiration for other pantheons is all drip fed to you over the 7 issues in this book. I think that's a strength of it. The bad part about it is this is not that interesting other than the mystery of who the Eternals are. So when I read this back in college, this was my first introduction to the Eternals, right? I'd heard the name, I knew Jack Kirby had done this story, but they weren't really in Marvel Comics a lot in the late 90s, early 2000s. So this was like their reintroduction to the Marvel Universe. Apparently Circe was a part of the Avengers, I think in the 80s and early 90s, and that's mentioned in this book. Like Iron Man goes up to her and is like, hey Circe, what's up? You're a former Avenger, you need to register, because this book came out post-Civil War. That definitely puts me in college when this book came out, because we're talking about the Superhero Registration Act. So if you don't remember that, go read Civil War and Iron Man, Director of S.H.I.E.L.D., and anything that happens to do after that, where you had superheroes had to register with S.H.I.E.L.D. and become officially agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. That led into Secret Invasion, Dark Reign, all this other stuff, and then eventually ends in Siege, that big arc. So this happens in like the beginning of that big arc in terms of where we are in the Marvel Universe. It's only referenced a little bit when Iron Man comes into the picture, but besides all that, you can read it separately and still kind of understand it. But yeah, so I'm getting excited talking about this book because there is a lot to talk about. There's a lot of mythology here. There's a lot of interesting things about these characters. The problem is this book doesn't really do that. what's more interesting about this book is talking about the background of it, about Jack Kirby, about his history, about how this is some sort of like recreation of what the New Gods were over at DC. It's not really talking about how exciting this book is to read. There's 7 issues here, and the first 6 issues are one story. The 7th issue is like a way too long epilogue, and that doesn't even really set up the ending. What's also weird at the time is when this was coming out, you had Thor doing the same thing under J. Michael Straczynski. Thor had died in Thor Ragnarok when Avengers Disassembled happened in 03-04, I believe, and you hadn't seen Thor for a while. So when Thor comes back in Civil War, you're a big surprise because he's been off the board for 4 or 5 years. Surprise, that's not really Thor. So when Thor comes back, I think when JMS took over in 07-08, you have Thor waking up the Asgardian gods from their human form, basically doing the same thing that happens in Eternals. So I think and that's a much better story. The art is by Olivier Coipel, and it's a much better hook. There's a lot more action per issue. You have a showdown with Thor and Iron Man about the whole clone Thor, or Clor as he got called later on. There's a lot of things with Loki in there coming back as a woman, and you have Jane Foster, and Donald Blake is back. A lot of interesting things in that series compared to this, which is kind of doing the same thing, but with characters you don't really know. And even characters that don't know themselves. What's cool about the Thor storyline is Thor goes up and awakens them, and they immediately know who they are. And, oh yeah, I've been living as this human. It's almost transformational. It's as if Thor comes and touches my forehead, and my body disappears, and then my godlike body disappears. So I could be a 7-foot tall, black-haired cut guy, or I could turn into Heimdall, who in the comics is this big rotund guy, kind of like Hagrid and Harry Potter, right? It's transformational. Whereas in the Eternals, they meet each other and they kind of remember. It's almost like amnesia. They look the exact same. Sometimes they remember being in Eternals, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they get the right armor, and it's not until they die after this form that they actually become full Eternal. And in this series, at least until the 7th issue, Ikaris, or Ikaris as I want to call him, is the only one that really does that. So you only have one real full-powered Eternal. Everybody else is kind of at half power. And have half-powered gods running around who don't really want to be gods for 6 or 7 issues in the story doesn't make for an exciting hook. And I think that's where this fails. So it's more interesting to read if you've never been introduced to the Eternals before and you're not looking for a superhero slam bang action. That's great. The big climax here has to do with the Celestial. You have what's called the Dreaming Celestial in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, awakening. And that's kind of what they're building up. That's what this big splash page is about. Is there a battle with the Celestial? No. Why? The Eternals aren't allowed to harm Celestials. It's built into their DNA or their code or whatever. Do they battle the superheroes who want to show up and fight this giant god? No. They all have powers and they can make them do what they want. So it's all very anticlimactic, anti-superhero slam bang action, anti-excitement, and it's all about being calm and cerebral and thinking about these concepts and stuff like that. So I think Eternals is a misfire in terms of what Marvel wanted to do when they wanted a new modern classic from Neil Gaiman. Marvel's not known for these heady stories. They're known for straight superhero action for the longest time. They don't have a Watchmen, I think, which is a heady story, but it's got a great hook. They don't have anything like Dark Knight Returns. They're trying to do that with this Old Man Wolverine, Old Man Logan, Old Man Hawkeye. They're trying to turn Future Imperfect into that. But at the end of the day, those are great stories, but they're full of superhero action, not a big high concept. So when they got Neil Gaiman to come in and try and do that and rebirth the Eternals for them, I think it failed. And that shows because they had a second series, which I bought this trade paperback because I had this one. I was interested in it. Got the movie coming out. I want to, brush up on the Eternals for myself. And this book came out. I haven't read this book yet. We're going to read it, and we're going to do an overview and a review on it as well, because it's got great art by Daniel Acuna That's who is doing the covers. That deserves showing off. That's why we're going to do an overview. But this takes place directly after this book right here, with the Dreaming Celestial, and I think they're going and trying to, read through the first couple pages, and they're talking about waking up Eternals, right? The rest of the 100 that are, kind of introduced in this book. So this is like a direct follow-up, but it didn't do very well. Why? Because there's only 9 issues in here in an annual. So what happened to the Eternals since then? Nothing. There's a current series that's got 2 issues out. It's got great art by Esad Ribic. It's written, I want to say it's Kieran Gillen behind it, who's a great writer. Is it going to go anywhere? I don't know. I think it's out as a tie-in for the movie, which was supposed to have been out by now, right? And it's going to come out later. So is that going to last more than 6 or 12 issues? I don't know. It's too soon to tell. It's too soon to tell even if Eternals is going to be a big hit with audiences when it comes out, because we haven't seen a single still frame from it. We've seen some leaked promo art. We have the designs that were revealed at D23 when they revealed the cast, and that's why they have the cast. They have Kumail Nanjiani, Angelina Jolie, Brian Tyree Henry, Gemma Chan, the 2 guys from Game of Thrones, Kit Harington, and I remembered his name in the other video, not this one. The Robb Stark, the guy who played Robb Stark, he's in it. So that's why they have the cast they have. It's international, it's broad. You have some big stars in here. Who is Jrjr is played by a Mexican actress from Desperado and Dogma. I can't remember her name. Blanking on me. Anyway, it's got big stars in it, but I think those big stars are there to get people to come see the movie because it's got a high concept and some big heady ideas. Will it be a superhero slam bang action fest? I think so. I hope so. You got the concept art rich idea of the Deviants where nobody looks the same. So hopefully they take that idea and turn it up to 10 for that movie. But I think that's why this new series is out. So unfortunately, Eternals, as interesting as it is to talk about, as a book, at least from Neil Gaiman, is not that interesting. It's pretty to look at, good John Romita Jr. art, but John Romita Jr. drawn basically talking heads a lot for 7 issues. I did say there is 2 action scenes, and there's some other stuff that happens here as well, but there's no tension. There's no, there's only 1 double page splash, maybe 2. And John Romita Jr. is, at this point in his career, is a fantastic artist. And I feel like he was wasted on here by Neil Gaiman, even though they were like, this is one of our most legendary, famous, prolific artists here at Marvel they had at the time. So it was a good pairing in terms of like publicity, but in terms of execution, I think that's on Neil Gaiman. And, his name's in big font, so we got to blame him. Jrjr doesn't get big font treatment, he gets illustrated by. Now he does get spine treatment, and that's good for him. But we got to blame Neil Gaiman because he didn't deliver the goods here in terms of a good hook and an interesting story and suspense and a good climax. Didn't deliver. So that's my 20-minute review of Eternals. Did I talk about the book very much? I talked more about the high concept, I know, but I think you got to talk about it, and if you're really interested in it, I think this might be worth your time. But if you're not, you watch the video, if you watch the whole thing, and you're set to go for the movie, so enjoy it from there. So thank you guys for watching this long video. Don't forget to like down below, comment, subscribe, all that stuff helps the channel grow, and we will see you guys next time here in the Funny Pages.